It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Fred Singer to you, who really by now should need no introduction, but we share a lot of things in common. He graduated Ohio State. I used to teach there. He has his PhD in physics from Princeton, where I went to school. As most of you know, he launched the first set of weather satellites for the U.S. Government, so there's few people that know more about the climate than he. Currently runs the Science and Environmental Policy Project. He's a professor at George Mason University, an emeritus professor at the University of Virginia, and has been traveling the world the last 10 years, literally nonstop, lecturing about global warming. His early book, Hot Talk and Cold Science, was one of the very first shedding light on climate change, and his recent book with Dennis Avery, Unstoppable Global Warming Every 1,500 Years, was a bestseller. It's in its second edition and probably the best book out on the subject. So with no further ado, Dr. Singer.
Thank you very much, Jay. Jay's an old friend of mine, lives in Ohio, and I visited him, had pleasure staying in his house, which is constructed on logs, as I remember. Yep. Very unusual place, very unusual man. Now, I prepared this talk some time ago, and I sent in some slides. To be honest with you, I've forgotten what they are, because it's been so long ago, and so many things have happened. So I thought I would spend this morning telling you just a few personal things about how I became a skeptic, and why I became a skeptic, and when I became a skeptic. It goes back to the beginning of the space age. Let me see what the slides actually do say.
Do we have a computer person here?
Oh.
There we go.
It says it, yes. How I became a skeptic. And the evidence against man-made global warming. It's a very, very brief summary here. The early years, oh, okay. Yes. I'll know how to work. Good. The early years go back to the beginning of the space age. That's about 50 years ago. I would call myself an agnostic. I'm an atmospheric physicist, space physicist. I knew about radiation. I knew about radiation leaving the atmosphere, radiation coming into the Earth. All very interesting stuff. I looked at it mainly from the point of view of what can be measured from satellites. I had no particular interest in climate as to how it was going to develop. I had no particular idea, no prejudices one way or the other. I should mention that by that time, in the middle 50s, the climate had been cooling for about 15 years, but no one was getting very, very excited about it. It was known, but it was not a source of concern. And certainly, there was no one in government who was involved in this in any way. Okay? Within a few years later, I'm still at the beginning of the space age, I found myself in charge of the weather satellite program, as Jay has pointed out. And one of our activities was to set up a national service which would take data from these new weather satellites that had just been developed and transfer them to meteorologists who were making weather forecasts. So our primary interest was in forecasting, improving forecasting. No concern about climate. And the instruments we designed were not really designed to measure climate, that is, they didn't have any particular stability built into them. We built an instrument to measure infrared radiation coming from the atmosphere. And I designed an instrument at that time, or even before then, to measure ozone in the stratosphere. All very interesting and all very scientific. And of no policy concern at the time. Little did we know. Little did we know. Well, 10 years later, 1968, I remember organizing a conference for the American Association for the Advancement of Science in Houston. And it may have been the first of these conferences that dealt with global issues. In fact, the title of the conference was Global Effects of Environmental Pollution. And you'll be pleased to know that the issue of climate played a minor role. We were mainly concerned about real pollution, things like mercury, arsenic, acid rain, and things of that sort. There was a long discussion about climate. It was part of the program. And that was the first meeting at which Manabe from Princeton presented his very first results on climate models, which indicated a warming from carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, which we'd always suspected because that was what Arrhenius did 100 years ago. But he had a complicated, advanced mathematical model, the first of these general circulation models, GCMs, and the forerunner of all the other models that have since been used and on which billions and billions of dollars have been spent. Obviously, Manabe was of the opinion that the increasing amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which at that time already had been measured, would lead to global warming. But there was also another school, a vocal school, led by Reed Bryson, which believed that the future was a cooling of the climate. And the data actually supported them because the climate was cooling. So there was somewhat of a debate as to whether the climate would warm or cool, and as I recall, they were about evenly divided. My own position was that of an agnostic. I didn't know. I had no idea whether it was going to warm or cool, but I listened with great interest to all the discussion and finally decided I couldn't make up my mind. I do remember a panel discussion, and the venerable Roger Revelle was on the panel, holding forth on his views on climate. And Roger's views were, yes, carbon dioxide is increasing. It wouldn't be interesting to see if it has any effect. It's an interesting geophysical experiment. So he looked at it from that point of view. He was a scientist, and he wanted to see, are we going to see any result of these increasing greenhouse gases? Will they really produce a climate effect? I was very impressed by his presentation, which was, according to my taste, very good. He was sort of agnostic. He said, well, I don't know what's going to happen. Let's just see. Let's measure. That's what we need to do. Okay. 20 years later, and that's sort of 30 years after the beginning of the space age, in 1988, I finally got turned on. And I guess what turned me on, and I should really thank him if he were here, is Jim Hansen. It was the first of these many, many attempts to hype the science and to make it look catastrophic. It was done in July of 1988 in testimony in Washington during the middle of a tremendous heat wave and drought in the United States. So it made a big impression on Congress and on the US public. But during all of this time, the satellite data, which of course I was paying great attention to, were not showing any warming. They were showing a slight cooling. And they had been in operation for a decade. Well, a decade is not a very long time, they said, but still. In the decade between 1978 and 1988, the satellite data essentially showed no warming, just a slight cooling. And I take satellite data very seriously. Most people take surface data seriously. I don't. I take satellite data seriously. Anyway, it occurred to me that they were not taking into account negative feedbacks. The models at that time, and they still do, predicted a temperature rise of 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade, 0.3. They've now decreased it slightly to accommodate observations, to accommodate reality. But at the time it was 0.3, and the actual observations from satellites showed zero, nil, zilch, nada, nothing. So there was a disconnect. And that was the first time when I began to doubt the reality of man-made global warming, 1988. And I remember publishing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which pointed to a rather simple kind of negative feedback, namely increased cloudiness, because warming of the ocean will produce more evaporation will put more moisture into the atmosphere, giving rise to possibly more clouds, if there were enough cloud condensation nuclei present. I didn't go into the details, and people still haven't quite covered all those details. But that seemed like an obvious and simple kind of negative feedback which the models were not handling. In fact, the models didn't know how to handle clouds at all. And at that time, we already knew that depending on how you handle clouds, you could get a huge warming or a modest warming or a little warming. It all depended on the droplet size distribution in clouds, which no one had any clue about. And certainly the models didn't know how to predict the droplet size distribution of clouds. They can't even predict clouds, never mind the details of cloud physics. Well, from then on, of course, we watched carefully as the IPCC started to issue its reports, its famous reports. The first one in 1990, by the way, I need to mention here, the IPCC was set up specifically to demonstrate the importance and presence of man-made global warming, which means that their modus operandi was to neglect and ignore anything that contradicted the wisdom, accepted wisdom at the time, of man-made global warming. So we have the 1990 report, which was not very informative, but tried to claim that the observations are in general agreement in accordance with model predictions. Of course, they were not, but it gave enough ammunition to the politicians. So by 1992, the Rio Conference was able to end up with a global climate treaty in 1992. And by the time the second IPCC report came about in 1995, it provided the ammunition for the Kyoto Protocol, which was concluded in 1997. So these two things worked hand in glove. You had IPCC supporting the politicians, and the politicians supporting the IPCC with funds and other emoluments. In the meantime, by Kyoto, 1997, the satellites were still not showing any warming. Very, very disturbing. And now the question was, is there really any evidence for man-made global warming? That began to occur to us at about that time, that there may not be very much to this whole matter, or it may be so small that it may be completely negligible, insignificant. That's my present view right now, and it's based on much better data. Some of these data were discussed yesterday, first by David Evans, then by Jack Schmidt, and then by David Douglas. And they all boil down to the fact that we now have strong evidence against any appreciable man-made warming coming from the pattern of warming that's observed compared to the pattern of warming that's calculated. I'm talking here about the so-called fingerprints. I don't need to project that anymore. You probably have seen enough of these, but you know that models all predict the existence of a hot spot in the atmosphere at about 8 kilometers or so altitude, and the observations not only don't show the hot spot, the observations actually show a cold spot. Well, you cannot get much more disagreement. David Douglas and I published all this material in 2004, then again in 2007, and finally the NIPIC report, the non-governmental, I always have to think, Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, NIPCC. Some people say it stands for Never IPCC or Not IPCC or whatever. We thought we would model this report in the pattern of the IPCC, and it is clearly a report that contradicts directly the main conclusion of the IPCC. The main conclusion, just to remind you, is that the warming, as they refer to it, is certainly man-made. This is their conclusion. And how sure are they? Well, between 90% and 99% sure. How do they know this? We don't know. What is the evidence for it? They have none. No evidence that will stand up to examination. None whatsoever. Well, I will go on to the next step now. In the time-honored tradition of the IPCC, we published a summary first. We published a summary last year, and it was presented here at this meeting. You may recall it's now been reissued in slightly better form in April 2008, and the report has finally come out. The report is available to you for examination here. You're invited, as you heard this morning, to look at the report. It's now in galley form, and indicate if there are any sections that you'd like to review. We encourage you to do that. Sign up to be a reviewer, and Heartland will email you the section that you signed up for. You can review it and send us comments. Getting back to the science. How much time have I got?
You're okay. About 8 minutes.
5 more minutes, okay. We've gone a little further on the science. Jay mentioned a book called Hot Dog Cold Science, which I wrote over 10 years ago. And at that time, in reviewing the evidence, I noticed that there are also proxy data. So in addition to satellite data and surface data and balloon data, we also have proxy data. The proxy data at that time that I focused on were tree rings and ice core data. And it was strange that the tree rings showed no warming since 1940. I repeat that. The tree rings, and that's published in the literature and reviewed in my book, the tree rings showed no warming since 1940. In the ice core data, which of course apply principally to Greenland and not global, ice core data showed no warming since 1940. In fact, the chief author of the ice core report, Dorte Dahl-Jensen from Denmark, specifically in her graph said, we don't see any warming after 1940. Nothing. So could there be something wrong with the observations? I finally reached the conclusion, yes, there is. The surface observations are influenced by the urban heat island effect and by many other factors that you heard about yesterday. They're so unreliable that they should just be rejected completely. As Joe D'Alio discussed earlier here at this meeting, the rural weather stations have been mostly abolished during the 1970s. So we're left mainly with weather stations at crucial locations like airports. And perhaps we should all agree here that airports are warming. But that's not global warming. Yeah. Well, it's not surprising. You know, air traffic has increased. My airport, Dulles Airport near Washington, used to be out in the boondocks, out in the country. It's now become a major city. It's surrounded by office buildings, by asphalt, concrete, high-rises. They've added runways. Planes are landing all the time and taking off. You know, it's become a very busy place. And of course, it's a lot warmer than it was 20 years ago. Has nothing to do with greenhouse gases. It's a local warming effect. So the surface data should be rejected. The satellite data are still okay. There have been some corrections to them. They've now, I think, passed the test. But when you look at the satellite data carefully, and we do this in the NIPIC report, which I hope you'll look at, in the summary, which was published last year, you'll see that there is a slight statistical fiddle in there. And I'll explain it very quickly. What you actually see in the satellite data is no warming from 1979 to 1997, a sudden jump, and then again, no warming and a slight cooling in the last 10 years. Now, you can represent this information in two ways. One way is the way I've just described it, and the other way is to draw a straight line from the beginning to the end. And if you do that, you obviously will get a warming trend. But is that a real warming trend? That's the question. Because the jump that we see is not due to carbon dioxide. It's an El Nino effect. So you have to be very, very careful when you talk about climate trends to be able to distinguish between a real trend, as I call it, and one that's artificial and caused only because of an existence of a jump. Finally, last word, what about the temperature data from the ocean? That's a very, very difficult subject. I've reached the conclusion that these are also suspect, but obviously not because of the urban heat island effect. There's another effect that enters in, which I will not have time to discuss, but is again discussed in the NIPCC report. And we'll probably talk about it later this morning when we have our panel discussion. So, to sum up, in the last 50 years, I spent 30 years as an agnostic and 20 years as a skeptic. I think there's no question now in my mind that the IPCC results are suspect, not only suspect but wrong, that the amount of global warming is minimal, the anthropogenic global warming is minimal and of no significance, and that all efforts by our politicians and other assorted helpers like Al Gore and so on, to do something about climate are useless, ineffective, and extremely expensive. Thank you.